Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1. The Dead Man's Confession. "Suicide, is it?" Inspector Graves muttered, peering down at the lifeless form of Harold Winthrop slumped over his writing desk. "Quite a tidy affair, I must say." Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, adjusted her gloves. Her keen eyes took in the scene. Harold's still form, the revolver loosely gripped in his right hand, the neatly typed sheet of paper on the desk before him. "Rather convenient, wouldn't you say?" she murmured. Graves turned sharply. "What precisely do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" She gestured toward the paper. "A written confession, Inspector. Rather unusual, don't you think? To admit to a murder and then, well, take one's own life." Graves snorted. "Men in despair do strange things. Winthrop confesses to a crime from 30 years ago. A guilty conscience finally catching up with him, and in the end he—" Graves made a vague motion towards the revolver. "Well, there you have it." Miss Marple approached the desk. The confession was neatly typed, the signature bold and clear at the bottom. She read aloud, "I, Harold Winthrop, hereby confess that on the night of September 14th, 30 years past, I did with full intent and malice aforethought take the life of Reginald Cartwright. This burden I have carried, and now, unable to bear it further, I seek my own punishment." She paused, then turned to the inspector. "Reginald Cartwright, you say?" "A businessman. Vanished decades ago. Now we know why." Miss Marple shook her head. "But my dear Inspector, Reginald Cartwright is alive." A heavy silence filled the room. "Alive?" Graves repeated, his face darkening. "Indeed, he resides in London." Graves exhaled sharply. "Then what the devil is this supposed to mean?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she bent over the paper once more. Harold's body was rigid, his fingers stiff where they barely curled around the revolver. The typewriter on his desk was pristine, yet something about it troubled her. She straightened, her voice mild. "It is quite strange, is it not? A confession of murder. But the supposed victim is very much alive. And this, Inspector," she tapped the paper lightly, "is rather too orderly for a man about to take his own life." Graves frowned. "Meaning?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said carefully, "Most suicides do not end so tidily, Inspector, particularly not after making such an extraordinary statement." Before he could reply, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and a woman's voice, thick with suppressed tears, called out, "Harold! Oh, Harold!" Margaret Winthrop, the widow, swept into the room. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, dressed in mourning black, though her expression held more shock than grief. "This must be a mistake," she whispered, staring at the body. "Harold he couldn't." She swayed slightly, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, stepped forward to steady her. "Come now, my dear, do sit." Margaret allowed herself to be led to a chair. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. "He'd been restless lately," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I knew something was troubling him, but I never imagined—" Her Eyes darted to the paper on the desk, reading the words, then recoiling as if burned. "No, this isn't possible. Harold never killed anyone." Graves sighed. "Mrs. Winthrop, your husband left this note himself. He must have carried the guilt for years." She shook her head vehemently. "But why now? Why, after all this time, would he suddenly confess?" Miss Marple was watching her closely. "You are certain he was in distress?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes, I mean, he was preoccupied, distant even. But Harold always had his moods. Yesterday, he was writing letters most of the day. He barely spoke to me." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "Letters?" "Yes. He was in his study all afternoon. I left for the social club in the evening. When I returned, he had already gone to bed." Graves jotted something in his notebook. "You were out the whole evening?" Margaret hesitated again. "Yes. I only returned late." Miss Marple noticed the slight pause. Before she could ask further, the hallway filled with heavy, hurried footsteps. A man in his 40s, dishevelled and red-faced, burst into the room. "Where is he?" Inspector Graves turned with a scowl. "And you are?" "Arthur Brentwood," the man snapped, his breath heavy with exertion. "And I demand to see that damned confession." Margaret flinched at his tone, but Arthur paid her no mind. He gaze locked on the typewritten page, and as he read, his hands clenched into fists. "So it's true?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "You knew Harold Winthrop?" Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh. "Knew him? That man was a murderer." He jabbed a finger at the confession. "That's proof! He killed my father!" Margaret gave a strangled gasp. "No, it's not true!" Arthur ignored her, turning to Graves. "I want his death properly investigated. He thought he could confess and escape justice through suicide. Not a chance." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was rage in his voice, but also something else. Something uncertain. "Graves," sighed. "Mr. Brentwood, I sympathize, but Reginald Cartwright is alive." Miss Marple interrupted quietly. Arthur froze. "What? Reginald Cartwright is alive," she repeated. "Which means this confession is not what it seems." Arthur stared at her, then turned sharply to Graves. "Then someone else must have been murdered. The man was guilty of something. You need to dig further." Graves rubbed his temple. "Blast it all. This just became more complicated." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Harold's stiff fingers, then to the typewriter, then to the too-neat page of confession. "Oh, I rather think it was complicated from the very start," she murmured. Arthur's nostrils flared. "I won't let this lie. If the confession's a lie, then someone else is covering for him, and I will find out who." Margaret gave a small whimper. Graves pinched the bridge of his nose. Miss Marple merely smiled, her mind already turning. A very peculiar suicide indeed. Chapter 2. A Widow's Alibi. Margaret Winthrop sat stiffly in the drawing-room of her home, hands folded tightly in her lap. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting faint patterns on the carpet, but she seemed unaware of it. Across from her, Miss Marple regarded her with quiet interest, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I do apologize, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I know this must be a dreadful time. but it is always best to clear up any little confusions early on. Margaret's lips pressed together. I have already told Inspector Graves everything. There is nothing more to say. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, though I do find it curious that Harold never spoke of Reginald Cartwright. You were his wife, after all. Margaret flinched at the name. I don't recall ever hearing it. Miss Marple tilted her head. But you must admit it is rather strange. Harold never mentioned a man he supposedly murdered. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. No, Harold was secretive, but I never imagined anything like this. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the folds of her skirt. Perhaps he did it before we married. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed mildly, though one does wonder why such guilt would surface after all these years. Margaret's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Irritation? She looked away. Mrs. Winthrop, Miss Marple continued, yesterday evening you mentioned you were at your social club. May I ask what time you returned home? Margaret looked up sharply. I told the inspector already. I returned late. Quite, Miss Marple said, knitting away. But late is rather a vague word, isn't it? Was it before midnight? After? Margaret's fingers tightened. I believe it was shortly before midnight. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. It is rather fortunate that your husband was already asleep when you returned. Seeing as he must have died soon after, Margaret's face paled. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. A moment later, Emily Parsons, the housekeeper, stepped in. She was a stout woman with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Emily said, addressing Margaret, "but the inspector was asking if you'd like tea sent up." Margaret nodded distractedly. Yes, please." Emily hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Winthrop came home earlier last night than usual, Miss Marple." A silence settled over the room. Margaret turned to her sharply. "What?" "I remember, because I was in the kitchen setting things straight before bed. It was just past 10 when I heard the front door close." Margaret's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "You must be mistaken." Emily frowned. "I don't think so, ma'am. I just finished putting away the silver." She turned to Miss Marple. "That's why it's stuck in my head, you see." Miss Marple nodded kindly. A reliable housekeeper always notices such things. Margaret gave a thin smile, but her eyes were dark with something else. Perhaps I lost track of time. May have arrived earlier than I thought." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, "though that would mean you were home for nearly 2 hours before Harold—" She gestured gently, "took such a drastic step." Margaret's mouth tightened. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Forgive me for prying, dear, but did you see Harold at all when you returned?" Margaret hesitated, and for a brief moment something flickered across her face. Guilt, fear, or both? "No," she said finally. "I went straight upstairs. He was in his study, I assume." Miss Marple gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Yes, one would assume so." Another knock interrupted them. This time it was Inspector Graves. His expression was sour. "More trouble," he muttered, stepping inside. Margaret stiffened. "What, now?" Graves ran a hand through his greying hair. "I've checked with the social club. You left at 9:30, Mrs. Winthrop. Not much of an alibi." Margaret's face drained of colour. Graves folded his arms. "Care to explain why you said you came home near midnight?" Margaret's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stopped, inhaled sharply, then exhaled. I didn't think it was important. I must have lost track of time. Graves snorted. Funny how people lose track of time when they need an excuse. Margaret's gaze darted to Miss Marple. The elderly woman remained serene, her expression unreadable. Graves leaned forward. What were you doing between 9:30 and 10? Margaret swallowed. I took a walk. I needed air. In the dark, she lifted her chin. Yes, I do that sometimes. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And did you meet anyone? Pass by anyone who could confirm that? Margaret hesitated. No, I was alone. Graves exhaled, shaking his head. Mrs. Winthrop, a false alibi does not look good. You'd best be honest now, rather than later. Margaret's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Margaret was a woman who had spent years keeping up appearances, but fear, real fear, was starting to seep through. Emily Parsons, still standing by the door, spoke hesitantly. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Mrs. Winthrop wasn't her usual self yesterday. Margaret turned to her sharply. Emily, that's enough. But Emily pressed on. When she came in, she was pale as a ghost, went straight up to her room, didn't even ask after Mr. Winthrop like she usually did. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on her lap. Is that so? Margaret's breathing was slightly uneven. I was tired, and I had a headache. Graves exhaled, looking at Miss Marple. Well, it's not solid proof, but I don't like it. Miss Marple nodded. Nor do I. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. I did not kill my husband, Miss... Marple studied her for a long moment, then said softly, I wonder, dear, if you are afraid of something. Margaret's lips parted slightly, her face suddenly unreadable. She faltered, then turned away. Graves straightened. I'll be looking into this, Mrs. Winthrop. If you're hiding something, it will come out. Margaret didn't respond. Miss Marple, however, merely gave a thoughtful hum. As she and Graves left the house, the inspector sighed. What do you make of her? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A woman who is afraid is often more dangerous than one who is angry. Graves snorted. And what exactly do you think she's afraid of? Miss Marple looked ahead, her blue eyes sharp with quiet certainty. That, my dear Inspector, is what we must find out. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Chapter 3. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Inspector Graves strode briskly along the quiet village lane, his expression grim. Miss Marple, keeping pace beside him with surprising ease, had her hands neatly folded over her handbag. I tell you, Miss Marple, I don't like it, Graves muttered. Margaret Winthrop's alibi is full of holes, and she's hiding something. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. But you see, that is precisely what troubles me. Graves frowned. How do you mean? She is afraid, but not in the way of a guilty woman. Guilt makes one defensive, irritable, or sometimes too cooperative. But fear, true fear, makes people evasive. They seek to avoid rather than explain. Graves huffed. Same difference in my book. She's hiding something, and until I know what, she stays on my list." They reached a modest little cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was set slightly apart, its windows shuttered as if to keep out prying eyes. Arthur Brentwood's cottage. Miss Marple glanced at the inspector. Mr. Brentwood seemed very determined when we last saw him. Graves grunted. "Yes, too determined, if you ask me." He raised a hand and knocked firmly. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing Arthur Brentwood, his expression taut and expectant. "Took you long enough," he said sharply, stepping aside. "Come in." The sitting room was simple but neat, with a heavy oak desk in one corner. Papers were scattered across it, some yellowed with age. Arthur gestured toward them. "I spent half the night going through my father's old files," he said. "He kept everything, business records, letters, receipts. He was meticulous, you see. And I've found something interesting." Guillaume folded his arms. "Go on, then." Arthur picked up a worn envelope. "This letter was sent to my father 30 years ago, from Harold Winthrop." Miss Marple took the letter carefully, reading the faded ink aloud. "Reginald, you must understand that what happened was unavoidable. The consequences were not intended, but now there is no way back. I can only hope that time will settle matters." She looked up. Not quite a confession, but an implication of something serious. Arthur nodded. "And yet my father never spoke of it. I believe Harold wronged him in some way, perhaps in business." Miss Marple tapped the letter thoughtfully. "And yet your father did not vanish. He continued his life in London." Arthur exhaled sharply. "Exactly. Which means Harold's so-called confession was a lie. But why would a man falsely admit to murder?" Miss Marple glanced at Graves, then back at Arthur. "That is precisely the question, Mr. Brentwood." Arthur ran a hand through his hair. "I met Harold once, years ago. My father took me to see him. I was a boy, but I remember it well. There was tension between them, something unresolved. My father left in anger, and he never spoke of it again." Graves frowned. "What did Harold say?" Arthur hesitated. "I don't recall exactly, but I do remember this. Harold looked relieved, almost as if he had expected worse." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "How peculiar!" Arthur's fists clenched. "If Harold was responsible for something, I want to know what. And if someone killed him, I want the truth." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. There was anger in his voice, yes, but also something else. A deep need to understand. Graves sighed. "Well, this letter certainly complicates things." He turned to Miss Marple. "What do you make of it?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I think we must ask a very simple question." "And what's that?" Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. If Harold Winthrop did not kill Reginald Cartwright, why did he believe he needed to say he had? Arthur tensed. "Are you saying someone made him write that confession?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not quite, Mr. Brentwood. I am saying that perhaps Harold's greatest mistake was believing something to be true when it was not." A silence settled over the room. Graves rubbed his chin. So either he was misled, or he was protecting someone. Miss Marple nodded. "And given Mrs. Winthrop's peculiar behaviour, I do wonder if she might know more than she admits." Arthur exhaled sharply. "Then you think she—" Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "No assumptions, Mr. Brentwood. Only careful observations." Arthur muttered something under his breath and turned toward the desk. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling out a second envelope. "This was sent to my father 6 months ago." Miss Marple opened it, scanning the brief, typewritten words. "I know the truth. It will not remain hidden forever." Her eyes lifted. "No signature?" Arthur shook his head. "None. My father never mentioned receiving it." Graves scowled. "Someone wanted your father to remember the past." Arthur nodded. "And perhaps someone wanted Harold Winthrop to confess to something he didn't do." Miss Marple folded the note. "Which means someone has been stirring the waters." Graves sighed. "And we still don't know who." Miss Marple smiled. "Not yet, Inspector, but I do believe we are getting closer." As they left Arthur's cottage, the inspector turned to Miss Marple. "So what now?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat. "Now, dear Inspector, we must ask ourselves, who stood to gain the most from Harold's death?" Graves grunted. "And I suppose you already have a theory." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, not quite. But I do believe a conversation with Mrs. Winthrop's housekeeper might be most enlightening." And with that, they walked on, leaving. Behind the man who knew too much, yet not quite enough. Chapter 4. The Housekeeper's Whispers. Emily Parsons had worked in the Winthrop household for nearly 20 years. She knew the rhythm of the house, the secrets that clung to its walls like dust in the corners. And now, as she sat across from Miss Marple in the small servants' sitting room, her usually steady hands fidgeted in her lap. Miss Marple, ever patient, regarded her with a kindly expression. "I do appreciate your time, dear. It must be rather difficult after such a dreadful event." Emily sighed. "It's not just the murder, miss. It's the way things have felt these past months, as if something was bound to happen." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "That is often the way with these things, I find. Tensions build, little things shift, until suddenly there is a breaking point." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, that's it exactly." She glanced toward the door, as if ensuring no one was listening. "Mrs. Winthrop hasn't been herself, you know, ever since that first letter came." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "First letter?" Emily nodded. 6 months ago, one arrived for Mr. Winthrop. I didn't see what was inside, but I remember how he reacted." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And how did he react, dear?" Emily's lips pressed together. "He turned white as a sheet, miss. I'd never seen him like that. He locked himself in his study for the rest of the day. When he finally came out, he looked old, as if something had drained the life from him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did he speak of it?" "No, miss, but that was the start of it all. He began drinking more. He was distracted. And then, a month later, there was another letter." Miss Marple's knitting paused briefly. "Another?" Emily lowered her voice. "That one Mrs. Winthrop saw first. She was dusting in the study when the post arrived, and she opened it. I saw her face when she read it. She was trembling." Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the significance immediately. And yet she never mentioned it. Emily shook her head. "She tucked it away before Mr. Winthrop came in. I don't know if she ever told him what it said." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on her lap. And did you notice anything else, dear? Emily hesitated. Well, there was one thing. That same night I heard them arguing. Not loud, mind you, just enough that I could tell something was wrong. Miss Marple gave a small smile. A housekeeper always knows. Emily sighed. Aye, and the next morning Mrs. Winthrop looked as if she hadn't slept at all. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Do you believe she was afraid, Emily? Emily swallowed. I think she was terrified. A silence settled between them. Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice thoughtful. Fear, my dear Emily, is often more dangerous than anger. A frightened person makes desperate choices. Emily shivered. Do you think she... Miss Marple patted her hand. We mustn't rush to conclusions. But tell me, did Mr. Winthrop receive any more letters before his death? Emily nodded, slowly. One more, miss. A week before he died. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. And what did he do after reading it? Emily exhaled. He burnt it, miss, right in the fireplace. Miss Marple considered this. I see. And did Mrs. Winthrop know? Emily hesitated. I believe so. She was watching from the doorway. She didn't say a word. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. And what of the night he died, Emily? Did you hear anything unusual? Emily looked down. I heard voices, miss, not raised, just tense. I couldn't make out the words. Miss Marple nodded. And what time was this? Clem thought for a moment. Must have been past 10. Miss Marple's knitting resumed. You told me earlier you heard Mrs. Winthrop come in at 10. Emily hesitated. Aye, miss, but she wasn't alone. Miss Marple's hands paused again. Oh? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. I heard the front door close, and then footsteps. 2 sets. A long silence followed. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. Emily, dear, I must ask, are you certain? Emily swallowed. I am, miss. Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, but there was a certain glint in her eyes. Then I do believe this changes things. Before Emily could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Inspector Graves entered, his face set in a grim expression. He looked from Emily to Miss Marple. Well, he asked, anything useful? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, yes, Inspector. Quite a bit, actually, Graves sighed. Good, because we've just had another development. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh? Graves crossed his arms. The handwriting in Harold Winthrop's confession? It doesn't match his other writings. Emily gasped. Miss Marple, however, merely nodded. Well, well, she murmured. That does make things rather interesting, doesn't it? Graves huffed. I suppose you're going to tell me you already suspected that. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, Inspector, one must always consider the possibility that a confession is not quite what it seems. Graves rubbed his temples. So, now we've got a widow with a false alibi, letters that frightened the victim, and a confession he likely didn't write. He exhaled. This case is turning into a proper mess. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, thoughtful. Oh, not a mess, Inspector. A puzzle. And I do believe we are beginning to see the edges of the picture. Graves grunted. If you say so, but I'd feel a lot better if we knew who was with Margaret Winthrop that night. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, dear Inspector. I rather think that is the next question we must answer." And with that, the pieces of the mystery began to shift into place. Chapter 5. The Man in the Shadows. Inspector Graves paced Miss Marple's sitting room, his frustration evident. "So, we have Margaret Winthrop coming home at 10 o'clock, but she wasn't alone. The confession was likely forged, and Harold Winthrop was receiving threatening letters." He threw up his hands. "But we still don't know who was with her that night." Miss Marple, seated primly with her knitting, smiled gently. "We are narrowing the possibilities, Inspector. The more we understand what happened before the murder, the clearer the identity of the murderer will become." Graves grumbled. "That's all well and good, Miss Marple, but right now we're still missing pieces." Miss Marple's gaze twinkled. "Oh, but I do believe we may have an opportunity to find one." Graves frowned. "And how's that?" Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Mrs. Winthrop's solicitor, Mr. Jameson, has requested to see me." Graves blinked. "You?" Miss Marple nodded. "It seems Mrs. Winthrop has been making arrangements." Graves rubbed his chin. "You think she's trying to cover something up?" Miss Marple merely smiled. "I think we shall soon find out." "And the solicitor's office?" The office of Peter Jameson was a modest but well-kept affair, with dark wooden bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk at the centre. The solicitor himself, a wiry man in his 60s with thinning grey hair, stood as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming." He gestured toward a chair. Miss Marple sat, hands folded neatly in her lap. "You wished to see me, Mr. Jameson." Jameson sighed. "Yes, I must confess, Miss Marple, I am troubled." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A solicitor who is troubled is often a sign that something is amiss." Jameson hesitated. "It's about Mrs. Winthrop. She came to see me this morning." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "She wanted to change her will." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she leaned forward ever so slightly. "Did she indeed?" Jameson sighed. "She instructed me to transfer all her assets to her nephew, Roger Winthrop." Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on her handbag. "Roger Winthrop? I was not aware she had a nephew." Jameson nodded. "He lives in London. She has mentioned him before, but has had little contact with him over the years." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "And she wished to change everything in his favour." Jameson hesitated. "Yes, but there was something else. She also wanted to ensure that certain papers in her late husband's study were destroyed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "How very curious!" Jameson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "She was agitated, Miss Marple. I asked if she was certain, and she only said I must put things right." Miss Marple considered this. "A most interesting phrase." Jameson exhaled. "Miss Marple, I don't wish to betray a client's confidence, but I fear Mrs. Winthrop is acting out of desperation." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Desperation, dear Mr. Jameson, is often the undoing of those who seek to conceal the truth." Jameson leaned forward. "Do you believe she's guilty?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Guilt comes in many forms, Mr. Jameson, but I do believe she knows more than she has admitted." A silence stretched between them. Finally, Miss Marple rose. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Jameson. You have been most helpful." Jameson hesitated. "Miss Marple, should I carry out her request?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I should think, Mr. Jameson, that a solicitor must always act in the best interests of his client, and sometimes that means delaying certain actions just a little." Jameson exhaled. "I see." Miss Marple gave him a knowing smile and departed. An unwanted visitor, Miss Marple, had just stepped onto the quiet high street when she became aware of a man watching her from across the road. He was tall and thin, with a sharp-featured face and dark eyes that followed her every movement. She continued walking at her usual pace, but as she turned the corner, she suddenly changed direction, slipping into a narrow passage between two buildings. A few moments later, she heard hurried footsteps. She waited. The man passed the alley, pausing briefly to look around before moving on. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. How very interesting. A conversation with Inspector Graves back at the police station. Miss Marple recounted her meeting with Mr. Jameson. Graves frowned. She's changing her will? And trying to destroy papers? Miss Marple nodded. It suggests that whatever she fears is tied to something in those documents. Graves muttered, "We need to get into that study before anything disappears." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, I do believe that would be wise." Graves leaned forward. "What do you think she's hiding?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Perhaps not what she has done, but what she has come to realize. Graves shook his head. "And that man who was following you, any idea who he is?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I have my suspicions, Inspector. And I do believe we may be meeting him very soon." Graves huffed. "You always seem to know more than you let on." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, Inspector, one must never reveal all one's cards too soon." Graves sighed. "Right. Let's go see about those papers before Mrs. Winthrop gets rid of them." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, let us do that." As they left, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, and soon the man in the shadows would have no choice but to step into the light. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Study. The Winthrop house was eerily silent as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple stepped inside. The housekeeper, Emily Parsons, met them in the hallway, her expression tight with concern. "Mrs. Winthrop has gone to the church," she murmured. I don't know how long she'll be." Graves gave a curt nod. "Then we'd best not waste time." Emily hesitated. "Are you looking for something specific, Inspector?" Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. "Only the truth, dear." Emily glanced toward the closed study door. "I never liked going in there, not since the master died." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Then perhaps it is time to see what he left behind." With that, Graves pushed open the heavy door, the study of Harold Winthrop. The room smelled faintly of old paper and tobacco, the air thick with the weight of unfinished business. The desk stood in the centre, an imposing piece of furniture with deep drawers and a worn leather top. Graves went straight for the papers stacked neatly by the fireplace. These must be the documents Mrs. Winthrop wanted destroyed. Miss Marple walked slowly around the room, her fingers lightly brushing against the bookshelves. "A study is often a reflection of the man who keeps it," she murmured. "Neat, orderly, but with something hidden beneath the surface. Graves grunted as he sifted through the papers. "These are all financial records, nothing unusual." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a small locked drawer at the side of the desk. "And what about that, Inspector?" Graves followed her gaze. "Locked." He turned to Emily. "Do you know where the key is?" Emily hesitated. "Mrs. Winthrop has it. She keeps it in her jewellery box upstairs." Miss Marple smiled. "Then perhaps we must find another way." Graves examined the lock before pulling a thin metal tool from his pocket. "This should do it." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "How very resourceful of you, Inspector." With a few practised movements, the lock clicked open. Graves pulled the drawer open and froze. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. A single envelope, yellowed with age, rested on top. Miss Marple reached out delicately and took the envelope. She turned it over, her keen eyes catching the smudged ink of the sender's name. She read it aloud, her voice steady. "Eleanor Redfern." Graves frowned. "That name means something to you?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, Inspector. Eleanor Redfern was Harold Winthrop's former fiancée." Graves's brows shot up. "Former?" Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully. "She disappeared 25 years ago. The ghost of Eleanor Redfern." The letter was brief, but its contents were chilling. "Harold, you cannot keep this secret forever. The past will come for you, no matter how deeply you bury it. You know what happened to Eleanor, and so do I." Graves exhaled sharply. "So, Winthrop was being blackmailed." Miss Marple tapped a delicate finger against the paper. "Yes, Inspector, and I rather suspect that this is the reason for those letters Emily mentioned." Graves frowned. "But who sent them?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That, dear Inspector, is the next question we must answer." Graves gathered the letters and placed them in a folder. "If Winthrop was hiding something about Eleanor Redfern, then we need to know exactly what." Miss Marple smiled. "And I believe I know precisely where to begin." Graves looked at her warily. "Why do I get the feeling you already have a theory?" Miss Marple chuckled. "Because, Inspector, one must always consider the sins of the past when trying to understand the crimes of the present." A widow's reaction, Margaret Winthrop returned home just as Graves and Miss Marple were leaving the study. Her face, already pale, turned even whiter when she saw them. What are you doing?" she stammered. Graves held up the folder. "Going through your husband's papers, Mrs. Winthrop. Something we should have done sooner." Margaret's eyes darted to Miss Marple. "You had no right." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And yet, Mrs. Winthrop, I do believe we now understand why your husband was so afraid." Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the stair railing. "I don't know what you mean." Graves stepped forward. "We found letters, Mrs. Winthrop. Letters that prove Harold Winthrop was hiding something about Eleanor Redfern." Margaret inhaled sharply. "No, I didn't know." Miss Marple studied her. "Didn't you?" Margaret's lips pressed together. "I knew he was troubled, yes, but I didn't know why." Miss Marple's tone remained kind but firm. "Then why did you try to have those papers destroyed?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid of what they might mean." Graves folded his arms. "You weren't afraid of what they meant, Mrs. Winthrop. You were afraid someone else might see them first. Margaret closed her eyes. You don't understand. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Then help us, dear. Help us understand. Margaret opened her eyes slowly. I don't know everything, but I do know that Harold did something terrible, something he could never speak of. Graves narrowed his eyes. And you were trying to protect him. Margaret exhaled. I was trying to protect myself. A heavy silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle. Mrs. Winthrop, on the night your husband died, you were not alone when you came home. We know that. Margaret stiffened. Miss Marple continued. Who was with you? Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Graves leaned in. Mrs. Winthrop, if you are protecting someone, now is the time to speak. Margaret swallowed hard. I can't. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Then I fear, dear, that the truth will come out in a far less forgiving manner. Margaret closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't kill him, she whispered, but I know who did. Miss Marple and Graves exchanged a glance, and with that, the past finally began to reveal its secrets. Chapter 7. A widow's silence. Margaret Winthrop's whispered confession hung heavy in the air. The drawing room, with its heavy curtains and silent fireplace, seemed to close in around them. Inspector Graves leaned forward, his tone firm but calm. You say you know who killed your husband, Mrs. Winthrop. Then tell us. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She looked away, her breathing shallow. I can't. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unyielding. Can't or won't? Margaret's shoulders shook slightly. It isn't that simple. Graves folded his arms. You have valuable information, Mrs. Winthrop. Information that could solve your husband's murder. If you're withholding it, that makes you an accomplice after the fact. Margaret flinched. You don't understand. If I say it aloud, if I admit it, it will destroy everything. Miss Marple studied her carefully. The truth has a way of coming out, my dear, whether we like it or not, and the longer we try to suppress it, the more damage it tends to do. Margaret swallowed hard. I need time. Graves shook his head. Time for what? Another murder? Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. No, it's not like that, I swear. Miss Marple gave her a kind but firm look. Then perhaps you should explain exactly what it is like. Margaret remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Graves sighed in frustration. Fine, we'll be back, Mrs. Winthrop. But mark my words, this won't stay buried forever. Miss Marple watched as Margaret turned her gaze toward the window, staring blankly at the empty garden beyond. She saw it then, not just fear, but something deeper. A terrible grief, and perhaps just a hint of guilt. As they stepped outside, Graves muttered, She's hiding something. We could bring her in. Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet, Inspector. She is teetering on the edge. A little patience, and she will tell us everything. Graves frowned. And if she doesn't? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then we must ensure she has no other choice. An unexpected visit. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found a visitor waiting for her. A man, thin and nervous-looking, stood. near her garden gate, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. She approached calmly. "Good afternoon. May I help you?" The man swallowed hard. "You're Miss Marple." "I am." He cast a wary glance around. "I need to speak with you." Miss Marple nodded towards the garden bench. "Then let us sit. You look as though you've something heavy on your mind." The man hesitated before sitting down beside her. "My name is Daniel Hargreaves. I was a friend of Harold Winthrop." Miss Marple's sharp eyes studied him. "A friend?" he exhaled. "Well, not exactly. More of a business acquaintance." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And what business was that?" Hargreaves hesitated. "I helped him cover something up." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Go on." Hargreaves ran a hand through his thinning hair. "It was about Eleanor Redfern." Miss Marple remained quiet, allowing him to continue. "She didn't disappear, Miss Marple. She was murdered." A cold breeze stirred the leaves in the garden, but Miss Marple did not flinch. "And Harold Winthrop was responsible." Hargreaves shook his head. "No, not directly, but he helped bury the truth." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Then who did kill her?" Hargreaves hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know, but I do know that Harold was being blackmailed for years about it. Someone else knew." Miss Marple tapped, her fingers against her handbag. "And you, Mr. Hargreaves, why are you telling me this now?" His face twisted. "Because I'm next." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Next?" Hargreaves nodded frantically. "I got a letter this morning. The same kind Harold used to get. Someone knows that I was involved. And now that Harold's dead, I think they're coming for me." Miss Marple studied him. "Do you still have the letter?" He fumbled in his coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Miss Marple took it delicately and read the single sentence inside. "You buried the truth once. Now it's your turn to be buried." Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and looked up. "Then, my dear Mr. Hargreaves, I do believe you are in very grave danger. A race against time." Miss Marple wasted no time in calling Inspector Graves. Within the hour, they were gathered at the station, the letter laid out before them. Graves rubbed his temples. "So, now we have a second victim in waiting." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Not if we can prevent it." Graves glanced at Hargreaves. "You need to tell us everything. No more half-truths." Hargreaves nodded, his fingers twitching. "I was young. I was working as a clerk for a solicitor in London. Harold Winthrop came to me in a panic one night. He said Eleanor Redfern had died in an accident, but he didn't call the police. He needed someone to make sure certain documents disappeared." Graves narrowed his eyes. "What kind of documents?" Hargreaves swallowed hard. "A marriage certificate." Miss Marple blinked. "They were married." Hargreaves nodded. "Secretly. Harold's family didn't approve. If it had come out, it would have ruined him." Graves muttered a curse. So he covered up her death to protect his reputation? Hargreaves's face was pale. "I think so, but someone else knew. Someone who started blackmailing him years later." Miss Marple tapped her chin. "And now, with Harold gone, they're turning to you." Hargreaves nodded miserably. "I don't know what to do." Graves stood. "You stay here. We'll have an officer watch you." Hargreaves looked relieved. "Thank you." Miss Marple, however, was thoughtful. Inspector, I believe we are looking at this the wrong way. Graves frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple's expression was calm but certain. The blackmailer isn't just seeking money or revenge. They are tying up loose ends. Graves exhaled sharply. You think they'll try to kill Hargreaves? Miss Marple nodded. And soon. Graves straightened. Then we set a trap. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed, Inspector. It is time to catch a murderer in the act. A silent threat that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a figure stood in the shadows outside the police station, watching. A thin smile curled on their lips. One down, one to go, and then, finally, the past would stay buried. Chapter 8. A trap is set, Miss Marple sat in Inspector Graves's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching as the inspector paced. Daniel Hargreaves had been placed in a secure room at the station, but even there the air of danger hung thick. Graves exhaled heavily. So, we're dealing with someone determined to silence anyone who knows the truth about Eleanor Redfern. They killed Harold Winthrop, and now they're after Hargreaves. Miss Marple nodded. And the blackmail letters suggest a calculated plan. This is not someone acting impulsively. They have waited years for their moment. Graves rubbed his chin. We need to draw them out. But how? Miss Marple smiled faintly. By giving them exactly what they want, Inspector. Graves raised an eyebrow. You mean use Hargreaves as bait? Miss Marple inclined her head. Not quite. If we make it seem as though Hargreaves has remembered something crucial, something that could expose them, our murderer may be forced into action. Graves considered this. A public statement, then. Something to make them panic? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. A carefully crafted piece of news, suggesting that Hargreaves now recalls details about the night Eleanor Redfern vanished. Graves smirked. You're more devious than you look, Miss Marple. She chuckled. One must occasionally set a fox trap if one wishes to catch a particularly clever fox. The news spreads by the next morning. Word had begun to circulate. Hargreaves, under police protection, had reportedly remembered a crucial detail about Eleanor Redfern's disappearance. It wasn't long before reactions came pouring in. Margaret Winthrop arrived at the station, her face pale. Is it true? She demanded as soon as she saw Inspector Graves. Does Hargreaves really know something? Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Perhaps, Mrs. Winthrop. Why does that concern you? Margaret hesitated. Because if Harold was involved in something terrible, I need to know. Miss Marple studied her carefully. And if he was, dear, what would you do? Margaret swallowed hard. I just want the truth. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. Then I suggest you wait, just as we must. Margaret nodded, but her fingers twisted anxiously in her gloves. As she left, Graves muttered, She's afraid of something. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Yes, Inspector. The question is, what? An intruder in the night that evening. Graves arranged for a plainclothes officer to watch Hargreaves's room from a hidden position in the corridor. Miss Marple sat quietly in a chair outside the station knitting. As dusk settled over the village, she had chosen her place carefully, where she could see anyone approaching. The streets were mostly empty, but at 9:30, a shadow moved near the station's side entrance. A figure, cloaked in darkness, hesitated just long enough to check the surroundings before slipping inside. Miss Marple's fingers stilled over her knitting. She turned to the officer standing nearby. "It is time, I believe." The officer nodded and moved swiftly. Inside, Graves had already been alerted. The figure crept toward Hargreaves's door, hand reaching into their coat. The lights in the corridor blazed on. "Don't move!" Graves barked, gun drawn. The figure froze. Then, slowly, they turned. Miss Marple stepped forward. Her expression was calm. "Ah," she murmured, "I rather thought it might be you." The killer revealed. The intruder lifted their head, revealing their face in the harsh light. It was Reverend Peter Alden. Graves frowned. "What the devil are you doing here, Alden?" The vicar's face was pale, but his voice remained measured. I heard about Hargreaves' revelation. I wanted to speak with him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You wished to silence him, you mean?" Alden shook his head. "No, that's absurd." Graves stepped forward. "Then what's this?" He reached into Alden's coat and pulled out a small vial. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Laudanum!" Graves's expression darkened. "Enough to put a man into a deep, untraceable sleep, one he wouldn't wake from." Alden's hands trembled. You don't understand." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Then help us understand, Reverend." Alden exhaled shakily. "I was trying to protect the church, protect Eleanor's memory." Miss Marple nodded. "Because she was your sister." Alden's head jerked up. "How did you—" Miss Marple smiled softly. "You are a good man, Reverend. But when Harold Winthrop's name was mentioned in connection with Eleanor, I noticed something. Your hands clenched as though restraining great emotion, and when I read of Eleanor's past, I found mention of a brother, one who later changed his name." Alden's shoulders sagged. "Yes, she was my sister." Graves frowned. "That still doesn't explain the murder." Alden's voice turned, bitter. "I didn't kill Harold Winthrop, but I knew what he had done. He ruined Eleanor. He promised to marry her, then abandoned her when his family objected." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And she died because of it." Alden's jaw tightened. "She took her own life." A heavy silence followed. Graves muttered a curse. "So, the blackmail." Alden exhaled. "I wanted Harold to pay. I sent the letters, yes. But I never wanted him dead." Miss Marple studied him. "And yet you came here tonight with poison." Alden's eyes darkened. "Because I knew the real killer would try again." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting. "Then you know who it is?" Alden nodded. "I do." Graves took a step forward. "Tell us." Alden closed his eyes briefly, then spoke. "It's Margaret Winthrop." The final clue. Graves swore under his breath. "Harold's own wife?" Alden nodded. "She found out about Eleanor. She learned about the affair, the secret marriage. She hated him for it." Miss Marple sighed softly. "And when the blackmail began again, she assumed Harold had given in. She feared the scandal would ruin her." Graves clenched his jaw. "So she killed him." Alden exhaled. "She did it quietly. Poison, most likely. But she underestimated how much Harold had already told me." Miss Marple gave him a sharp look. "Which is why you feared she would kill Hargreaves as well." Alden nodded. "I had to stop her." Graves shook his head. "You should have come to us." Alden let out a dry laugh. "Would you have believed me?" Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic look. "Perhaps not. But now, dear Reverend, we have all the proof we need." Graves straightened. "Time to pay Margaret Winthrop a visit," Sir Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector, before she strikes again." And with that, the hunt for the final truth began. Chapter 9. The Widow's Last Move. The evening air was crisp as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple approached Winthrop Manor. The grand house loomed in the dimming light, its windows dark except for a faint glow from the sitting-room. Margaret Winthrop was inside, and if Reverend Alden was right, she had already killed once. Graves adjusted his coat. If she knows we're on to her, she might try to run. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Or she may be waiting for us, Inspector. A spider often does, once caught in its own web." They stepped up to the front door, and Graves knocked firmly. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, dressed in mourning black, her pale face unreadable. "Inspector," she greeted coolly. "Miss Marple." Graves didn't waste time. "Mrs. Winthrop, we need to speak with you. May we come in?" Margaret hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping aside. "Of course," Miss Marple observed. "Her closely." The woman's fingers twitched slightly at her side. A nervous habit or anticipation? They followed her into the sitting-room, where a single oil lamp cast long shadows against the walls. Margaret gestured to the chairs. "Would you like tea?" Graves shook his head. "No need for hospitality, Mrs. Winthrop. This isn't a social call." Margaret sat down gracefully, folding her hands in her lap. "Then what is it, Inspector?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "It's about your husband's murder, dear." Margaret's gaze flickered. "I see. And have you found the culprit?" Graves watched her closely. "We believe so." Margaret exhaled softly. "Good." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You do not seem surprised." Margaret's lips pressed together. "I assumed you would, eventually." Graves leaned forward. "We know about Eleanor Redfern." Margaret stiffened. "Do you?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear. We know she was Harold's first wife. We know he abandoned her. And we know that someone has been blackmailing him for years." Margaret's face remained carefully composed. "And you think I am responsible?" Graves's eyes narrowed. "Aren't you?" A pause. Then Margaret gave a soft, bitter laugh. "You think I killed my husband because of some old affair?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Not just an affair, dear. A marriage, a secret life, one that threatened everything you built with him." Margaret's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "If you already believe me guilty, why ask questions?" Graves's voice hardened. "Because we need you to confess." Margaret looked away, her jaw tightening. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "Mrs. Winthrop, what was Harold planning to do the night he died?" Margaret's breath caught. Just for a moment. Then she forced a smile. "He was going to write a letter." Graves frowned. "A letter?" Margaret nodded. "He told me that night. He said he was tired of secrets. He was going to confess everything." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And that is when you decided he had to die." Margaret's head snapped up. "That's absurd." Graves pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "We spoke to Reverend Alden. He said Harold was preparing to set things right, and that frightened someone. Someone who stood to lose everything if the truth came out." Margaret scoffed. "You trust the word of a bitter old vicar?" Miss Marple smiled. "And Daniel Hargreaves, dear. He too received a blackmail letter. And then someone tried to kill him as well." Margaret's breath came a little quicker. Graves pressed on. "We know Harold didn't die of natural causes. And we know he was about to confess something that would ruin you." Margaret's fingers clenched. "You have no proof." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Poison, my dear. A slow, clever one. Something that mimicked heart failure." Margaret's jaw tightened. "You're grasping at straws." Graves stood. "We'll see about that. We've already arranged for Harold's body to be examined again." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. You can't." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but unwavering. "We can, dear, and we have." A long silence stretched between them. Then something in Margaret's expression changed. A cold acceptance. "You think you're so clever," she murmured. Graves straightened. "Mrs. Winthrop." But before he could finish, Margaret's hand darted toward the side table. A small glass bottle. She uncorked it swiftly, bringing it to her lips. "No!" Graves lunged, knocking it from her grasp. The vial shattered on the floor, a pungent scent filling the air. Margaret let out a shuddering breath. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "You've already won." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Oh, my dear, there were other choices." Margaret closed her eyes. "Not for me." Graves turned to one of the constables. "Take her into custody." Margaret was led away. Miss Marple watched her go, sadness flickering in her eyes. "She loved him," she murmured. "But love, when mixed with fear, can turn into something quite dreadful." Graves nodded grimly. A confession written by a dead man, and a widow desperate to keep it hidden. Miss Marple folded her hands. "The past has a way of catching up with us, Inspector, no matter how hard we try to bury it." And with that, the case was closed. Chapter 10. The Final Puzzle. The morning after Margaret Winthrop's arrest, the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with hushed conversations. The murder of Harold Winthrop had been shocking enough, but the revelation that his own wife had poisoned him left even the most hardened gossips stunned. Miss Marple, however, was not entirely satisfied. She sat in her modest cottage, knitting, needles clicking softly as she replayed the events in her mind. Something was still amiss. Margaret had confessed, yes, but not directly. She had all but admitted to the crime through her actions. Yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Inspector Graves stood outside, looking grim. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "we have a problem." She gestured for him to enter. "I rather thought we might, Inspector." Graves sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Margaret refuses to speak. And worse, the coroner's report just came in." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "And?" Graves exhaled heavily. "No, poison." A pause. Then Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. None at all. Graves shook his head. Harold Winthrop didn't die from poison. He died from an air embolism, likely injected with a syringe. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. That changes everything. Graves nodded. Margaret might still be guilty, but we've been looking at this all wrong. Miss Marple's mind whirred. If Harold had been injected, then the murder was far more calculated than she had assumed, which meant Margaret Winthrop might not be the only guilty party. A visit to the vicarage, Miss Marple wasted no time. She made her way to the vicarage, where Reverend Peter Alden greeted her with a cautious smile. "Miss Marple," he said, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She stepped inside, glancing around. "I'm afraid I must trouble you with a rather serious matter, Reverend." He gestured for her to sit. "Of course." Miss Marple lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands in her lap. "I have been thinking, dear Reverend, about Margaret Winthrop's supposed guilt." Alden's expression didn't change, but she noted the way his fingers tightened, slightly on the arm of his chair. She hated Harold for what he had done to her sister, Miss Marple continued. "But tell me, do you think she was truly capable of cold-blooded murder?" Alden's throat bobbed. "She was desperate, Miss Marple. People do desperate things." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But I wonder, dear Reverend, if she was truly the most desperate person involved in this matter." Silence. Alden's gaze flickered. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "That perhaps you were the one who needed Harold Winthrop dead." Alden let out a short, humourless laugh. "That's absurd." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Is it?" She leaned forward slightly. "You told us you wanted Harold to suffer for what he had done to Eleanor. That is why you sent the blackmail letters. But blackmail was never enough, was it?" Alden's jaw clenched. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Margaret had motive, yes, but Margaret also lacked the medical knowledge to administer an air embolism." Alden's breath caught. Miss Marple continued. "But you, Reverend, spent time abroad, did you not? In a mission hospital, where you would have learned many things, including how to administer an injection." Alden stood abruptly. "This is nonsense." Miss Marple remained seated, calm as ever. "Harold planned to confess that night, didn't he? That's why you acted when you did." Alden's eyes darkened. "He had to pay for what he did," Marple nodded. "And so you killed him." A long, heavy silence filled the room. Then Alden exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "But I never meant to kill him that night," he murmured. "I only wanted him to suffer, to know fear." But when he spoke of Eleanor so callously, as if she had meant nothing, his voice broke. "I lost control." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Revenge, dear Reverend, is a most dangerous thing." Alden sat down, rubbing his temples. It was so easy. A small injection, nothing noticeable. And then I let Margaret take the blame. Miss Marple's eyes held sadness. She was guilty of hate, but not of murder. Alden's lips trembled. "And now?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "Now, Reverend, I suggest you do what Harold never could. Confess." Alden closed his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, "it's time." Justice served an hour later. Inspector Graves listened as Alden repeated his confession. When he finished, Graves exhaled. So, Margaret was innocent of the murder itself. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she hated Harold, but she did not kill him. Graves shook his head. I'll see to it that she's released. Alden sat in silence, his hands clasped together. She will never forgive me. Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic look. Perhaps not, but Eleanor would not have wanted this. Alden's eyes shone with unshed tears. No, he whispered. She wouldn't have. Graves gestured to the constables. Take him. As Alden was led away, Miss Marple sighed. A tragedy, Inspector. Graves nodded. But at least it's over. Miss Marple gazed out of the window. Yes, Inspector. The truth at last has been unlocked. Chapter 11. Shadows of the Past. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet in the days following Reverend Alden's arrest. The townspeople, who had been quick to gossip over the shocking revelations, now seemed subdued. Perhaps it was the weight of knowing that justice had been served, or perhaps it was the eerie realization that a trusted man of faith had harboured such darkness within him. For Miss Marple, however, there was still one last matter to attend to. She sat by her small writing desk, carefully penning a letter. The ink dried swiftly as she signed her name with a steady hand, Jane Marple. The letter was for Margaret Winthrop. It had taken some time to clear her name, and though Margaret had been released from custody, she had not left her home since. The burden of suspicion, even when lifted, was not so easily forgotten. Miss Marple, being the woman she was, would not let her remain in that darkness. She rose from her chair, tucking the letter into her handbag before donning her coat. Outside, the morning air was crisp, and the clouds overhead hinted at the possibility of rain. With purposeful steps, she made her way to Winthrop Manor. A widow's silence. The heavy iron gates of Winthrop Manor stood open. The house itself, though still grand, now seemed emptier than before. Miss Marple rang the bell and waited. Pause. Then the door creaked open. Margaret Winthrop stood in the threshold, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. There was something unreadable in her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet defiance. Miss Marple, she said, her voice even. I wasn't expecting visitors. Miss Marple offered a kind smile. I thought I might call upon you, dear. I hoped we could talk. Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. Very well. The sitting room was dimly lit, a single oil lamp casting flickering shadows against the high walls. The tea service sat untouched on the table, as though it had been prepared but never poured. Margaret took a seat opposite Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap. I suppose I should thank you, she said after a moment. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh? For proving I wasn't the murderer. Margaret's lips pressed together, though I don't imagine the village will forget that I might have been. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. The past is not so easily buried, dear, but nor should it be. Margaret exhaled, her gaze fixed on the window. I hated Harold. I won't deny it. When I thought I might hang for his murder, I even wondered if I deserved it. After all, I had wished him dead often enough. Miss Marple watched her closely. But wishing and doing are not the same, my dear. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly. No, but does it make me innocent? I may not have poisoned him, but I wanted him to suffer. And now he's dead, just as I wished. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. We are all capable of dark thoughts, dear, but we must not let them define us. Margaret gave a brittle smile. Easy words for a woman who has never had to endure what I have. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You have lost much, Mrs. Winthrop, but life, even now, is not beyond saving. Margaret looked away, her posture stiff. And what would you have me do? Miss Marple reached into her handbag, withdrawing the letter. Read this when you are ready. Margaret hesitated, then took the envelope. Staring at it as though it was something foreign, Miss Marple rose from her chair. The village will talk, of course, but in time they will find something new to whisper about. What remains, dear, is what you choose to do with your life now. Margaret's grip on the letter tightened slightly. I don't know how to begin again, Miss Marple smiled gently. One does not always have to know, dear. One need only take the first step. Margaret did not respond, but Miss Marple saw the faintest flicker of something in her expression, something that might have been hope. Loose ends, on her way back to the village, Miss Marple took a detour through the churchyard. It was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She paused before a modest headstone. Eleanor Redfern, beloved daughter, gone too soon. Miss Marple sighed softly. Rest now, my dear. She turned and found Inspector Graves standing a short distance away. You're a hard woman to keep up with, Miss Marple, he said. She smiled. And yet, here you are, Inspector. Graves glanced at the headstone. I suppose, in the end, justice was served. Miss Marple folded her hands. Of a sort. Graves exhaled. Alden's confession was thorough. He'll likely spend the rest of his days in prison. Miss Marple nodded. And Margaret? Graves hesitated. She'll be watched for a time, but legally she's free. Miss Marple regarded him carefully. And yet, that does not seem to sit well with you. Graves frowned. She may not have killed him, but she certainly drove him to his death. Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps. But she too was a victim of Harold Winthrop's deception. Graves ran a hand through his hair. The law doesn't always account for that. Miss Marple smiled wryly. No, Inspector, it rarely does. A silence stretched between them. Then Graves shook his head. Will you ever stop meddling, Miss Marple? She chuckled softly. Oh, Inspector, I do hope not. And with that, she turned, walking away as the village bells chimed in the distance. There were always more mysteries to uncover, but for now, at least, this one was solved. Chapter 12. The Last Word. The scandal of Harold Winthrop's murder had begun to fade from the lips of St. Mary Mead's residents, though whispers still lingered in the village grocer and outside the post office. Life was returning to its usual rhythm. The Reverend Alden was to stand trial. Margaret Winthrop had withdrawn into seclusion, and Inspector Graves had returned to his usual business. But for Miss Marple, there was always one last detail to consider. She sat in her cosy cottage, a fresh pot of tea steaming beside her, as she wrote a letter, a habit she often found useful when piecing together the remnants of a mystery. This letter, however, was not one she intended to send. It was merely an exercise in clarity, a way to order her thoughts before tucking them away. "My dear friend," she wrote, addressing it to no one in particular. "A crime, once solved, does not always bring closure. It is not the revelation of the culprit that lingers in the minds of those left behind, but rather the echoes of what has been lost." She paused, tapping the end of her pen against the paper. Yes, the case was over, but the consequences remained. Margaret's decision that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, nodding politely to those she passed. The air was crisp, the sky grey with the promise of rain. She had not expected to see Margaret Winthrop outside, but there she was, standing by the iron gates of Winthrop Manor, dressed in mourning black. A single suitcase sat at her feet. Miss Marple approached with her usual quiet grace. "Margaret, dear," she greeted gently. Margaret turned, her face paler than usual, but her expression resolute. "Miss Marple, you've caught me at a rather odd moment." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the suitcase. "Leaving, are we?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, I've decided to go away for a time. Perhaps France, perhaps further." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Running away?" Margaret's lips pressed together. "No," she said after a pause. "Not running, simply starting anew." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. "A sensible decision, my dear. Fresh surroundings can do wonders for the spirit." Margaret exhaled slowly. "I never thought I'd leave this place. It always felt like a prison, but I convinced myself it was home." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And now," Margaret glanced back at the grand house, "now I see it for what it is, a mausoleum of unhappy memories." Miss Marple nodded. "The past does have a way of chaining us, if we let it." Margaret turned back to her, eyes searching. "Do you think people can ever truly change, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, my dear, I think people can choose, and sometimes that is enough." Margaret looked down, her fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "Perhaps." A car approached, kicking up dust along the road. It came to a slow stop beside them, and the driver, a reserved young man in a dark cap, stepped out to load Margaret's belongings. Margaret hesitated for only a moment longer. Then she turned to Miss Marple. "Goodbye, Miss Marple." Miss Marple touched her hand briefly. "Good luck, my dear." Margaret nodded once, then stepped into the car. A moment later, she was gone. Miss Marple watched the vehicle disappear down the road, then turned back toward the village, her thoughts turning over like pages in a well-worn book. A visit from Inspector Graves later that evening. As Miss Marple settled into her armchair with her knitting, there was a firm knock at the door. She set her needles aside and rose to answer it. Inspector Graves stood on her doorstep, his coat dusted with rain. "Miss Marple," he greeted gruffly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She smiled. "Not at all, Inspector. Do come in." He stepped inside, shaking off his hat before placing it on the stand. "I just wanted to check in before I returned to London. The Alden case is progressing quickly. He'll be formally charged within the week." Miss Marple nodded. "A tragic thing, truly." Graves sighed. "Yes, but at least it's done." He studied her for a moment. "I expect you already knew how it would end." Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, Inspector, one can never predict the future. One can only observe the present. Graves smirked. You and your observations. He hesitated, then added, Margaret Winthrop left town today. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, I saw her off. Graves exhaled. She may not have killed her husband, but she certainly played her part in his downfall. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Guilt is not always measured by law, Inspector. Sometimes it is heavier than any punishment the courts could impose. Graves looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he picked up his hat. Well, Miss Marple, I imagine our paths will cross again. She smiled warmly. I do hope so, Inspector. With that, he stepped out into the night, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. A mystery concluded as Miss Marple returned to her writing desk, glancing at the letter she had started earlier. With a small, satisfied smile, she folded the paper and placed it into a drawer. Some mysteries, after all, were not meant to be shared. Outside, the village slept, the past settling into memory, and the future stretching onward. And for Miss Marple, there would always be another puzzle to solve. The end. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive. Until next time.